It was a morning like any other, or so I thought. The light streamed through the thin curtains, casting soft, warm slats across the floor of my bedroom. The quiet hum of the world outside, the distant chirping of birds, and the occasional rustling of trees in the wind had a soothing rhythm to them. The kind of sound that made the morning feel endless, timeless, as though nothing could go wrong. It should have been a perfect moment, a perfect start to the day. I woke to the faint sound of birds singing outside. It was still early. The world hadn't quite woken up yet, the sky just beginning to lighten with the first rays of the sun. The hum of a car driving past made it clear that some people were already awake, starting their days before the rest of the world. The clock on my nightstand read 8:23 a.m. Late again. I groaned inwardly at the realization, but the warmth of the bed kept me still for just a little longer, my body not quite ready to leave its comfort. I stretched lazily, feeling the satisfying stretch of my muscles, but the slow awakening of my mind was less certain. I could feel the weight of the dream I had been lost in, lingering like a cloud just out of reach. I couldn't quite remember it, only that it had felt significant, like it was a message, something important that I was supposed to understand. The feeling faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the quiet hum of reality settling in around me. For a moment there was a flicker of unease in my chest, but I dismissed it, pushing it down with the simple knowledge that I was just tired, just groggy from a night of restless sleep. The unease was only a byproduct of a dream, I told myself. Nothing more. I dragged myself out of bed, the soft covers reluctantly releasing me into the chill air of the room. The floor felt cold beneath my feet, the rough texture of the wood against my bare soles grounding me in the reality of the present. Max, my dog, was already awake. His large golden head poked out from the window beside my bed, his eyes scanning the world outside. He wagged his tail when he noticed me stirring. His eyes, wide and trusting, seemed to say, "You're awake." Finally. The simple sight of him, so eager and full of life, made me smile, and for a moment I allowed myself to enjoy the feeling of peace that settled over me. "Morning, buddy," I muttered, my voice rough from sleep, still not fully awake. Max padded over to me, his large paws light on the wooden floor. He nudged me gently with his nose, as though he'd been waiting for me all along. I smiled, scratching behind his ears, the familiar scent of his fur comfortingly filling my senses. His tail thumped against the floor in soft beats, echoing in the quiet room as I leaned down to give him a good morning hug. It was a simple moment, but it grounded me, tethering me to the day ahead. The world outside may have been asleep, but here, in the silence of the room, everything felt like it should. After a few moments of shared silence, I shuffled toward the bathroom, with Max following closely behind. His paws patted softly on the floor, a constant companion even in the mundane moments of the day. I went through my morning routine like I always did, brushing my teeth, washing my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror as I tried to wake up fully. I splashed cold water onto my face, the coldness jolting me further into consciousness. My hair was a mess, my eyes still heavy with sleep. The tiredness weighed on me, but it wasn't enough to keep me from moving, from starting the day. I looked at myself in the mirror, scrutinizing my face for any sign of life. I didn't feel awake yet, but there wasn't much choice. The house would soon be empty, and I had to get moving. My parents were off doing their usual Saturday errands, leaving me with the house to myself for a few hours. It was a rare moment of solitude, a space I would have normally relished. Yet, something about the morning was different. It wasn't the usual peace and tranquility that came with the absence of my parents. There was an unfamiliar stillness to it, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I left the bathroom, Max trailing behind me as I made my way to the kitchen. The scent of fresh coffee greeted me as I entered the room. The coffee machine was gurgling in its usual way, the comforting sound filling the air. I poured myself a cup, letting the warmth of the liquid seep into my hands, willing myself to wake up a little more. The bitter scent of coffee swirled around me, a comforting and familiar presence in the otherwise silent house. It was as if I could already feel the day starting to slip away, slipping into the inevitable motion of everything that had to happen. But for some reason, the weight of it all made it hard to shake off the unease that continued to hover in the background. Max, ever eager, stood by the back door, wagging his tail, clearly ready for our morning walk. I grabbed my jacket, slipped it on, and stepped outside with him. The cool, crisp air hit me instantly, filling my lungs with the sharp freshness of the morning. The breeze tousled my hair, but it was refreshing, not harsh. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so, as if the entire world was still asleep. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their leaves rustling softly, but the streets were almost unnaturally still. There was no rush, no hurry. It felt like time was stretching, pulling itself thin in the silence that surrounded us. Max trotted happily beside me, the leash tugging lightly in my hand with every eager step he took. His nose twitched as he picked up every scent, as if the world was full of tiny, hidden secrets that he was determined to uncover. He was always so alert, so aware of everything around him. I, on the other hand, found myself lost in thought, my mind sluggishly working its way through the fog of tiredness. The quiet, though soothing, felt unsettling. It was as though the universe was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The morning seemed to drag on longer than it should have, suspended in a strange stillness. The air felt thick, charged with anticipation. It was a sensation I couldn't fully shake, no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was just the tiredness from the night before. We walked for a few more minutes, the silence of the morning stretching between us. Max was lost in the world of smells and sounds, while I remained lost in my thoughts. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a pale, golden light over everything. I felt a fleeting sense of calm as I watched the world bathed in the soft light. But just as quickly as that calmness appeared, a strange sensation passed over me. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. I turned my head, blinking, unsure of what I had seen. A figure. It was standing at the corner of the street, perfectly still, too still, almost unnervingly so. I rubbed my eyes, unsure if I had imagined it. When I looked back, the figure was gone. Disappeared. The street was empty once more. A shiver ran down my spine. My heart rate quickened, and for a moment I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. But when I looked again, all I could see was the empty street. There was nothing there, nothing at all. It could have been a trick of the light, or perhaps my tired mind playing games with me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a momentary lapse in my focus. I continued walking, shaking off the unsettling feeling, but the unease persisted, sitting in my chest like a heavy stone. Max, however, didn't seem to notice anything. He was still happily trotting along, sniffing at the grass, oblivious to the strange sensation that had just swept through me. We finished our walk, returning to the house that felt almost too quiet now. The familiar sounds of the house, the ticking of the kitchen clock, the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed louder, more pronounced in the silence. I let Max inside, and he immediately bounded over to his favorite spot on the couch, curling up in a ball, his eyes half closed in contentment. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. I had about an hour before I needed to get ready for the day. My parents wouldn't be back for a while. It would just be me and Max until they returned, a rare moment of solitude. I sank into the couch beside Max, holding my cup of coffee, glancing at the TV. But nothing held my attention. My mind kept drifting back to the feeling from earlier, the odd sense of unease that I couldn't shake off. I tried to push it away, but it lingered, growing heavier with every passing minute. The silence of the house was deafening now. Every sound seemed to magnify, as if the house itself were waiting for something. I could feel it in my chest, the pressure building, but I didn't know what it was. I should have been doing something productive, something useful, but all I could do was sit there, waiting, as the quiet stretched on. And that's when the sound of a car engine broke the stillness. It was far off at first, but then it grew louder, closer. I glanced out the window, expecting to see my parents pulling into the driveway. But what I saw instead made my heart stop. The car was unfamiliar, a dark sedan, parked just at the end of the driveway, as if it had been waiting there for some time. The unease from earlier flared into something sharper, something more real. Something was not right, and I had no idea what was coming. Max's unease was palpable, more than just the subtle shift I had felt earlier in the morning. I had grown accustomed to his behavior, his playful energy, his endless enthusiasm for the simplest things, like a squirrel darting across the yard or a leaf tumbling from a tree. But today something was different. It wasn't the way he usually responded to the world, it was the way he withdrew from it, the way he held back from me. Max had always been a constant companion, always right there beside me, whether it was for a walk, a nap, or just sitting in the quiet of the house. But today he seemed distant, almost as if he were sensing something I couldn't quite put my finger on. After I'd noticed the unfamiliar car outside, I'd told myself it was probably just a neighbor or someone passing through. But that didn't explain Max's sudden change in behavior. He was sitting in the corner of the living room, his eyes fixed on the door, his ears perked up, as though waiting for something. Normally, Max would be lying on the couch, tail thumping in anticipation of whatever might come next, but now he was still tense. His body was rigid, as though the very air around us had shifted, and he felt it. I watched him for a long time, trying to gauge whether it was simply a matter of him being distracted by some noise or if there was something deeper, something more unsettling at play. It wasn't just his stillness either. It was the way he sniffed the air, his nose twitching rapidly, drawing in deep breaths, his nostrils flaring with every inhalation. I had never seen him so focused, so hyper-aware of everything happening around him. It was as if he were trying to decipher a mystery, something hidden beneath the surface that I couldn't understand. His eyes, usually bright and full of warmth, were now dark with uncertainty, clouded by something I couldn't quite place. I called his name, a gentle sound that usually sent him bounding toward me in an instant, his tail wagging furiously. But this time he only glanced over at me, his gaze briefly meeting mine before returning to the door. It wasn't the look of a dog distracted by something trivial, it was the look of a creature sensing danger, aware of something lurking just beyond the threshold of the known. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I watched him, realizing with a growing sense of discomfort that whatever had unsettled me earlier, whatever had been brewing in the quiet of the morning, was now affecting him, too. Max's behavior continued to spiral further into the unusual. He stood up abruptly, his muscles taut, his movements jerky as he made his way to the door. His paws clicked softly against the floor as he walked, his body tense, as though he were trying to hold himself together against an invisible force. He stopped right at the door, his nose pressed against the wood, breathing heavily as if he were trying to push through it to whatever was on the other side. His eyes never left the door, his tail no longer wagging, his whole body now rigid and alert. I felt a surge of concern. I had never seen Max act like this before. He wasn't just nervous, he was fearful. I walked over to him, calling his name again, trying to snap him out of whatever trance he had slipped into. But when I reached out to touch him, he recoiled, stepping back from me as if I were a stranger. Max had never shied away from me like that. I had been his person for years, the one he trusted above all else, the one who fed him, played with him, and kept him safe. And yet, right now, he seemed afraid of me. My heart began to race as I stared down at him, my own sense of unease growing stronger. I tried to pull him away from the door, gently coaxing him, but he resisted. His body was tense, his muscles straining as he kept himself pressed against the door, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty yard, the quiet driveway, and the shadows of the trees swaying gently in the wind. Max's breathing grew heavier, more labored. His chest rose and fell with each breath, and I could see the tension in his body, the way he seemed to be on the edge of something, like a wire stretched too tight, ready to snap at any moment. His eyes were wild now, darting back and forth between the door and me, as if he were trying to decide whether to stay with me or run. But where would he run to? And why, after all these years, was he suddenly so frightened? I stood there, unsure of what to do. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end, a prickling sensation creeping across my skin as if the air itself had changed. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a pressure building that I couldn't explain, something oppressive and cold. My thoughts raced, but I couldn't settle on anything concrete. Was it the car outside? Was there someone watching us? The idea was ridiculous, but Max's behavior made it feel more plausible, more real. There was something about the stillness of the house, the silence that stretched on far too long. It was as though time itself had been suspended, holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable to happen. I tried to calm Max down, running my hand over his fur, hoping the familiar touch would bring him back to me, to the normalcy we both craved. But it didn't work. He pulled away from me again, his body stiffening, as though he couldn't bear to be touched. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, the sense that something was wrong, that something was coming, and I wasn't prepared for it. My heart beat faster, each thud echoing in my chest as the atmosphere around us grew heavier. Max wasn't just reacting to something external, he was reacting to something unseen, something that both of us could feel but couldn't understand. The quiet of the house seemed to deepen, and the air felt thicker, as though the walls were closing in around us. It was then that I heard the sound again, faint at first, but unmistakable. A soft scraping, a slow, deliberate noise coming from somewhere in the hallway, just beyond the living room. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my blood run cold. I froze, my eyes snapping toward the hallway, my breath caught in my throat. Max's head jerked up at the same moment, his body suddenly alert, his ears flattened against his skull, his eyes wide with fear. He growled low in his throat, a sound so foreign coming from him that it sent a wave of dread through me. This wasn't a playful growl, nor was it one of the many noises he made when he was excited or trying to get my attention. This was a growl born of pure, unadulterated fear. I felt a tightness in my chest as I looked at him, my mind racing. Was someone in the house? No, I had locked all the doors this morning. The windows were shut, the blinds drawn. Everything was secure. But the sound was real. It was getting louder now, a scraping, like something being dragged across the floor, slow and rhythmic, as if it were moving deliberately toward us. My pulse quickened as I glanced around, trying to locate the source. There was nothing in the hallway, nothing that could explain the noise. And yet, it continued, growing closer, more distinct. Max's growl intensified, his body trembling with fear. He wasn't looking at me anymore, his eyes were fixed on the hallway, his entire being focused on the threat that I couldn't see. I knew then that whatever was causing him to react like this wasn't just in his head, it was real. My mind raced as I considered what to do. Should I call someone? But who? The neighbors were too far away to help, and I couldn't leave Max alone in this state. He needed me, but what could I do? The scraping sound reached its peak, now unmistakable, and I was certain it was coming from inside the house. I didn't know whether to stay or to run, but the sudden pressure of the moment made it clear the unease that had been lingering all morning was finally coming to a head, and whatever it wasn't something I could ignore anymore. The house had changed in that instant, transformed from a place of comfort into something unrecognizable, and Max was no longer just a dog. He was a warning, a sentinel, alerting me to something dark, something dangerous that I had no way of understanding. I took a step toward the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, my body tense with fear and anticipation. Max stayed close, his growl still vibrating in his chest, as though he was daring whatever it was to come closer. I wasn't sure what awaited us, but the feeling in the air was unmistakable. Something was coming, and the question was no longer what it was, but when it would finally reveal itself. The tension in the house had reached its boiling point. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, making it difficult to breathe. Max was still at my side, his growl never ceasing, his stance rigid as he stood guard at the threshold of the hallway. His eyes were locked on something unseen, the space beyond the hallway now a chasm of uncertainty and fear. The scraping sound had stopped for the moment, but the silence that followed was even worse, like the calm before a storm. I stood frozen in place, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. The fear that had gripped Max was now gripping me as well. Every instinct in my body told me to run, to escape the house, to get away from whatever was lurking just beyond the edges of my understanding. But something deeper, something stronger, held me in place. I couldn't leave. Not yet. The house had always been a place of comfort, a sanctuary where I could retreat from the chaos of the world. But now it felt alien. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to carry the weight of impending danger. I glanced around the room, as if I could somehow find an answer, as if the walls themselves could tell me what was going on. Max's low growl finally faded, his body still tense but now more alert than ever. He was watching the hallway, but it wasn't just the hallway that had his attention. There was something else in the air, a shift in the space itself, an almost imperceptible distortion that I couldn't quite place. My heartbeat quickened as I took a cautious step forward, moving towards the hallway. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grasped the doorknob of the hallway door. For a moment I hesitated, my fingers gripping the metal tight, feeling the coldness seep into my skin. Then, as if something invisible was urging me on, I twisted the knob and pushed the door open just a fraction. The creak of the old hinges sounded too loud in the silence, and I winced, expecting it to be heard by whatever or whoever was on the other side. The hallway was empty. There was nothing there. No figure lurking in the shadows, no intruder waiting in the dark. But the air was thick with an undeniable sense of something being wrong. The walls seemed to close in around me, the corners of the hallway stretching in unnatural ways. The house, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a maze, a labyrinth that I couldn't navigate. Max stood at my side, his eyes still fixed on the hallway, unwavering, as though daring whatever it was to show itself. His body trembled, his fur bristling with the strain of his heightened senses. I could feel his tension, feel the pull of something unseen, and it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. But still, there was nothing. I stepped forward, leaving Max behind for just a moment, my hand reaching out to touch the wall as I walked deeper into the hallway. The air felt colder here, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to stave off the chill that was beginning to settle deep into my bones. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. But even that sounded foreign, like the house itself was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. The farther I walked, the more I felt as if I were walking through a dream, each step disorienting, as though I were losing touch with reality. The hallway seemed to stretch on for longer than it should have, the light from the living room growing dimmer as I ventured further into the shadows. The paintings on the walls seemed to leer at me, their eyes following my every movement. The pictures, once comforting, now felt like ominous reminders of a past I couldn't quite grasp. Something was wrong with this place. Something was off, and I couldn't figure out what it was. As I reached the end of the hallway, I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow darting across the wall. But then, it solidified. A figure. A person, standing in the dark at the very edge of the hallway. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was a man, or at least it appeared to be. But there was something wrong with him, something unsettling in the way he stood there, still and unmoving. His face was hidden in shadow, his features obscured by the dim light. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel him. I could feel his presence in the air, the way the space around him seemed to warp and shift, as though the very fabric of reality had been disturbed. Max, who had been trailing behind me, suddenly bolted forward. His growl erupted from his throat, loud and ferocious, echoing through the narrow hallway. But the figure didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of awareness. It was as though he were an apparition, a ghost from another time, caught in some forgotten moment of the house's history. I called out to Max, trying to pull him back, to calm him, but he wouldn't stop. He was on edge, his fur standing on end. His eyes locked on the figure with an intensity I had never seen in him before. He didn't back down, didn't retreat. It was as though he was challenging the figure, demanding it to move, to reveal itself. But still, there was no response. The figure remained still, his silhouette a dark shape against the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a hesitant step forward. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to flee from this figure, from whatever it represented, but something deep within me held me in place. I had to know. I had to understand. I moved slowly, cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath me. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. It was as if I were invisible, as though I were a mere shadow passing by. The closer I got, the more I could feel the air around him thickening, becoming heavy with an unseen weight. The tension was unbearable, and I could feel it pressing down on me, threatening to suffocate me. When I was just a few feet away, I stopped, unable to take another step. The figure was still as ever, unmoving, silent. And yet, I could feel him. I could feel his presence all around me, closing in like a fog. It wasn't just the figure itself, it was something about him. Something ancient, something wrong. There was an energy around him that was suffocating, that twisted the air and made it difficult to breathe. Max continued to growl, but his voice was more strained now, as though he too were struggling to make sense of what was happening. I could see his body trembling, his tail tucked between his legs as he stood just behind me, unwilling to approach the figure any closer. He too felt the threat that I could not see, that I could not fully understand. But it was there, undeniable, lingering in the space between us. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I wanted to ask who he was, what he wanted, why he was here, but the words stuck in my throat, as though something was preventing me from speaking. The figure seemed to be draining the very air from the room, leaving me unable to form any coherent thoughts. The tension was unbearable, and I felt myself on the edge of panic, my body tensing, my hands shaking at my sides. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure moved. It wasn't a dramatic movement, not a sudden lunge or a menacing gesture. It was a subtle shift, a slight lean forward, as if the figure were coming to life for the first time. But that slight movement was enough to send me stumbling backward, my breath catching in my throat. Max barked sharply, but it was weak, a noise born of fear rather than aggression. I turned to flee, but as I did, I heard it. A voice. Low, gravelly, like something scraping against the inside of my skull. It wasn't words at first, just a sound, an inhuman noise that reverberated through the walls of the house, shaking the very foundation beneath my feet. And then the words came. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was like ice running through my veins, cold and sharp, and I froze in place. Max's growl intensified, but even he seemed to understand the weight of what was happening. The figure had spoken, and in that moment, everything changed. I didn't know who this figure was or what he wanted, but I knew one thing for certain: the house was no longer a place of safety. It was a prison, and the figure, whoever he was its warden. The walls were closing in, and I wasn't sure if I would ever make it out alive. The air inside the house felt colder, sharper somehow, and the tension was thick enough to slice through with a knife. Max still stood at my side, his fur bristling, his body tense as a bowstring, his eyes never leaving the spot where the figure had been moments before. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, urging me to make a decision, to move, to act, to do something to break the stillness. But every instinct in my body was screaming to stay still, to hold my breath and pray that whatever was happening would just pass, would fade away. But it didn't. Instead, there was only the oppressive feeling of being watched, the sensation of something dark and ancient lurking just outside the edges of my vision. I glanced around, my eyes searching the dimly lit hallway, the room, anything for an explanation. But there was nothing. Nothing except the shadows that stretched long and unnerving in the corners of the house, and the unsettling presence of Max, who had not once taken his eyes off the space where the figure had been standing. I felt something else in the air, too, something that I couldn't quite name. It was like the house itself was holding its breath, like everything was on the verge of shifting, of breaking. The silence that followed the figure's strange departure hung heavy between us, suffocating in its stillness. And then, like a sudden gust of wind, the front door slammed open with an explosive force that made me jump out of my skin. Max barked sharply in surprise, but his reaction was fleeting. He immediately calmed, as though the sound had shaken him from the tension he'd been holding, snapping him back to reality. My body went rigid, my heart stuttering in my chest as I turned toward the doorway. Footsteps followed, quick and measured, a familiar rhythm that pulled me from the depths of my confusion. I blinked, my mind racing, and in that moment, I couldn't quite understand what I was hearing. My parents who were supposed to be away for another few hours, who I hadn't expected to return until late afternoon, were here. They were home. Hello. Is anyone here? My mother's voice rang out from the hallway, warm and familiar, but there was an odd, almost hurried quality to her tone. She always had a way of making her presence known, her voice carrying the same sense of calm and security that I had grown up with. But today, something was different. There was an edge to her words, a sense of urgency that made my skin prickle with unease. Max turned his head toward me, his eyes wide, his ears alert. He wasn't reacting the way he usually did when my parents came home happy to greet them, tail wagging, bounding forward in excitement. Instead, he was tense, standing perfectly still, as if unsure whether to trust the new presence in the house. I could see the confusion in his eyes mirrored in my own. What was going on? How could they be back so early? I took a few shaky steps toward the hallway, my feet moving almost without my conscious direction. My body was still humming with the energy of the encounter with the figure, the unease still lingering in my bones, and yet the sound of my mother's voice was like an anchor, pulling me back toward the safety of normalcy. But the more I moved, the more something felt off. The air in the hallway felt colder than it should have, and there was a heaviness in the house, a weight that seemed to press on my chest the further I went. As I reached the hallway, I saw them. My parents standing just inside the doorway, their backs to me. My mother was holding a grocery bag in her hand, her eyes scanning the living room, while my father stood next to her, wiping his hands on his pants as if he had been working outside. It looked so normal, so ordinary, but there was a tension in the way they stood, the way they glanced at each other as if something was unsaid between them. "Mom?" "Dad," I called out, my voice shaky and uncertain. My heart raced, still on high alert, but as I spoke, the words felt strangely foreign, like they didn't belong to me. They both turned to face me in unison, their expressions blank, unreadable. "Hey there, kid," my dad said, his voice soft but somehow distant. He looked at me, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. His gaze seemed to hover just above my head, almost as if he were seeing something else, something I couldn't see. The smile on his face was familiar, but it didn't reach his eyes. The warmth that usually accompanied his presence was absent, replaced by something colder, something that sent another wave of discomfort through me. My mother was silent for a moment longer. She put the grocery bag down on the counter, her movements slow, deliberate. She didn't seem to notice the strange look I was giving her, the way my body was still rigid with the remnants of fear. She just walked past me, her eyes scanning the room as though looking for something, someone. The way she moved was unnerving, as if she wasn't quite present, as if she were going through the motions without fully engaging with her surroundings. "Everything okay?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. I was grasping for any semblance of normality, hoping that somehow their return would explain away the fear that was still clawing at my insides. But even as I asked, I knew it wasn't enough. There was something wrong. My mother finally turned toward me, her expression shifting just slightly. She gave me a small, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, honey," she replied, her voice steady but somehow hollow. "Just tired from the errands. Nothing to worry about." She glanced over her shoulder at my father, who nodded in agreement, his eyes briefly meeting mine. But it wasn't a reassuring look. It was one that told me something else, something that didn't quite make sense. I tried to shake off the unease, tried to believe that everything was fine, but I couldn't. The house felt wrong. Their presence, instead of bringing comfort, only deepened the sense of disquiet that had settled in my gut. I wanted to ask them what had happened, why they were home so early, but the words felt stuck in my throat. I didn't want to sound crazy. I didn't want to be the one to bring up the figure I had seen, the strange encounter that still haunted me. Instead, I watched as my mother moved toward the kitchen, her footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. My father followed, still oddly quiet, as if they were both lost in thought. I stood there for a moment longer, trying to gather my thoughts, trying to piece together the events of the last few hours. But the more I thought, the more I realized something. Something about them was wrong. Something was off. Kai. Max, who had been quiet the entire time, now took a step forward, his ears flat against his head. He stood still for a moment, his gaze flicking between me and my parents. Then, without warning, he growled. It was a low, rumbling sound, more out of frustration than aggression. He didn't bark, didn't lunge. He just stood there, his body tense, his growl reverberating through the room like an unspoken warning. I froze, my heart leaping in my chest. My parents didn't react. They didn't flinch. My mother continued to unload the groceries, her movements stiff and mechanical, as though she were no longer fully aware of her surroundings. My father glanced at Max, but it was a strange look, more of acknowledgement than anything else. "Max," I said softly, stepping forward, trying to reassure him. But he didn't stop. His growl deepened, and his eyes never left my parents. I glanced at them again. There was the tension, the wrongness that I had been trying to ignore. It was in the way they moved, in the way their eyes seemed unfocused. It was as though they were not fully there, as though something had taken them from me, leaving only shadows in their place. The house, the place that should have been a refuge, was beginning to feel like a trap. And I wasn't sure if I could trust my parents anymore. I wasn't sure if I could trust anyone. The house was quiet, too quiet for comfort. The only sound that reached my ears was the faint hum of the refrigerator, a constant, unyielding presence in the kitchen. The air felt thick, as though something was pressing in from all sides, something waiting just beyond the periphery of my awareness. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was wrong. Every inch of this house seemed foreign now, as if the walls were closing in on me. Max, ever the silent observer, was still in the living room, lying on his belly with his head resting on his paws. His eyes were half closed, but his body remained tense, the muscles of his shoulders and legs coiled tightly, ready to spring into action at any moment. I'd never seen him like this, so alert, so ready for something that neither of us could quite name. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my gaze flicking back and forth between the familiar countertops, the hanging cabinets, and the refrigerator door. I had been here countless times, opening it, grabbing milk or fruit, maybe a cold drink to quench my thirst. But now it felt different, like there was something more to this room than I could understand. My mother was still moving through the house, quiet and methodical, her earlier strange behavior weighing on my mind. She seemed to drift, almost as though she were lost in her thoughts, her steps calculated and deliberate. My father, too, was nowhere near his usual self. They were like two shadows, their movements lacking the warmth and vibrancy they had always carried. They were empty. Something had drained them of life, and it gnawed at me, gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I needed a distraction. With a shaky breath, I opened the refrigerator door. The familiar chill hit my face, the coolness of it sending a shiver down my spine. Inside, there were the usual items, some leftovers in plastic containers, a few bottles of juice, a block of cheese, and half a head of lettuce. The fridge was stocked with the kinds of things you'd expect from a family home, things I had seen 1,000 times before. But as my eyes scanned the shelves, something caught my attention, something out of place. There, at the very back of the fridge, almost hidden behind a large jar of pickles, was a small, nondescript box. It was plain, cardboard, a little dusty, as if it had been there for quite some time. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Surely it had always been there, tucked away in the back of the fridge, forgotten, just like the other things that were easy to ignore. But this box, something about it felt wrong. It didn't belong. It wasn't something my parents would have put there. It wasn't something I had ever seen before. My heart began to race, the strange pull of curiosity fighting against the rising tide of unease. I knew I should leave it alone, knew that whatever it wasn't meant for me. But the feeling of something hidden, something I wasn't supposed to know, was too strong. I had to find out. Reaching into the cold space of the fridge, I carefully slid the jar of pickles aside, the faintest scrape of glass against glass sending a jolt of tension through me. I grabbed the box. It was light, surprisingly light for its size, and the surface of the cardboard was smooth, almost unnervingly so. It had no markings, no labels, no indication of what it might contain. It felt like a secret, the kind of secret that people keep buried away in the dark corners of their lives, away from prying eyes. For a moment, I simply stood there, holding the box in my hands, staring at it, feeling the weight of its silence pressing in on me. My hands trembled slightly, the fine hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I wanted to open it. No, I needed to open it. But something told me I was crossing a line. Once I opened that box, there would be no going back. My pulse quickened as I turned the box over in my hands. It was strangely warm, as if it had been placed somewhere it didn't belong. And then, without thinking, I flipped the lid open. Inside was a small metal object. At first, I thought it was some kind of strange tool, something that could easily have been overlooked, discarded in a moment of carelessness. It was a piece of machinery, compact, intricate in its design, but its purpose was unclear. The metallic surface was dull, tarnished, as though it had been sitting there for years. But what really made my blood run cold was the faint, eerie glow emanating from within the object. A pale blue light flickered weakly from a tiny crack in the side, like a dying ember in a forgotten hearth. My fingers hovered over it, hesitant. I didn't know what this thing was, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should already know. I had seen something like it before, but where? Why was this object hidden here, in the back of our fridge, of all places? The longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural energy. It was as though it were alive, responding to my presence, reacting to my curiosity. I could feel a pressure building in my chest, a sensation that something terrible was about to happen, that I was playing with forces I didn't fully understand. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively pulled my hand back from the box, as though the object might reach out and grab me. What was this? Why was it hidden here? Suddenly, a loud noise from the living room broke the silence, a sharp, clattering sound that made me jump. I whipped my head around, my pulse racing as I shoved the box back into the fridge with a quick motion, closing the door with more force than necessary. I stood there for a moment, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I had just found. But it was impossible. The unease had turned into something else, something darker, deeper, and now the house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something I couldn't see. Max's low growl reached my ears before I saw him. He was standing in the living room, his body rigid, his gaze locked on something that wasn't there. His eyes were wide, alert, and filled with an intensity I had never seen before. He looked at me, his expression pleading, as if trying to warn me, trying to tell me that I had done something I shouldn't have. Something was wrong, and Max could feel it. I moved toward the living room slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, my senses on high alert. The object in the fridge felt like a weight on my mind, a puzzle I couldn't solve, but one that had already begun to unravel everything I thought I knew. The house was no longer just a home. It had become a place of secrets, of shadows and whispers. And I was just beginning to realize how little I truly understood about what was happening here. As I walked into the living room, I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a sense that the world had tilted ever so slightly off its axis. My parents were sitting on the couch, silent, their eyes unfocused. They hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. It was as if they were frozen, locked in place by an invisible force. Max stood in front of them, his body tense, as though guarding them from something unseen. My stomach twisted with a sickening realization. Something had happened. Something had changed. My parents weren't themselves, and neither was the house. I didn't know what was going on, but the box in the fridge, the object hidden away in the dark, felt like the key to everything. And now, I had to figure out what it meant before whatever was happening here consumed us all. The days that followed the discovery of the box seemed to stretch into an endless, suffocating blur, each one dragging behind the last, as if time itself had become reluctant to move forward. The house felt heavier now, its walls pressing in with a quiet, invisible weight. It wasn't the house itself that had changed, but something within it, something that had latched onto the very air, filling the rooms with a presence that could not be ignored. Max, my once loyal and playful dog, was no longer the same. He had always been a creature of routine, his days marked by the predictable cycle of walks, playtime, and moments of quiet companionship. But now he was a ghost of himself, no longer the exuberant animal I had known. The warmth in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a flickering sense of unease, as if he too had been touched by whatever dark force was moving through the house. He no longer followed me around with the same enthusiasm. Instead, he sat in corners, his body hunched as if bracing against something unseen. His eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed constantly fixed on something I couldn't see, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end whenever I caught his gaze. Sometimes he would stare at me, but it wasn't the same affectionate look he used to give me. Now, there was something almost accusatory in his eyes, as though he knew something I didn't. And whatever it was, it terrified him. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that accompanied Max's strange behavior. But it wasn't easy. There were moments when he would suddenly snap to attention, his ears rigid, his tail stiffened, and he would start growling low in his throat, sometimes at nothing. And in those moments, I couldn't help but feel the hairs on the back of my own neck rise in response. I would check the room for anything that might explain his sudden shift, but there was nothing there, nothing at all. At night, he refused to sleep in his usual spot by the door. Instead, he would crawl into the darkest corner of the room, curling himself into a tight ball, his eyes never leaving the shadows that crept along the edges of the walls. I'd hear him whimper in his sleep, soft, plaintive sounds that twisted in my stomach, filling me with a strange kind of guilt I couldn't understand. I tried to comfort him, calling his name softly, coaxing him with treats or toys. But Max would simply turn his head, his gaze distant, his ears flat against his skull. It was as though he was trapped in some world apart from me, and no matter how much I reached out to him, he couldn't, or wouldn't come back. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been set into motion with the discovery of the box was now manifesting in ways that were beyond my comprehension. It wasn't just Max. The house itself had changed. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside the windows, felt loaded with meaning. The fridge, the source of so much unease, seemed to loom in the corner of the kitchen, its silent hum a constant reminder of the object it contained. Even though I had placed the box back in its hidden corner, I could still feel its presence, a quiet, insistent whisper at the back of my mind. My parents, too, had become different. They moved through the house in a daze, their actions almost robotic. The warmth that had once defined them was gone, replaced by an unsettling emptiness. My mother no longer spent hours in the kitchen, preparing meals or tending to the house. Instead, she sat for long periods of time at the dining table, staring out the window with a vacant expression. My father, who had once been full of energy and laughter, now seemed listless, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes constantly darting around the room as if searching for something he couldn't find. There was a distance between us, an invisible barrier that I could not break through. I wanted to reach them, to find out what had happened, to understand why everything felt wrong, but each time I tried to speak, my words seemed to fall flat, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the house. Max's behavior grew increasingly erratic. One evening, as I sat on the couch, flipping through the channels on the television, I heard him start to bark low and guttural at first, then rising in pitch as though something had triggered him. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing, and rushed into the living room. Max was standing at the door, his body trembling, his mouth open in a silent snarl. His fur bristled, his muscles taut, as if he were prepared to fight something invisible. But there was nothing there. I stood frozen, my mind spinning. What could he see that I couldn't? What was it that had him so worked up, so terrified? I reached for him, but as soon as I stepped forward, Max turned away, darting into the corner of the room and huddling there, shaking. I crouched down, trying to comfort him, but my touch only seemed to agitate him further. His growl grew louder, more desperate, and I could hear the faint rattle of his breath, as if he were struggling to breathe. His eyes locked on something across the room, his pupils dilated, and I followed his gaze. There was nothing but the dim light of the evening filtering through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. But Max wasn't looking at shadows. He was looking at something more, something real, something terrifying. And whatever it wasn't for me to see. Over the next few days, Max's behavior grew even more bizarre. He stopped eating, his once ravenous appetite replaced by an almost total disinterest in food. I'd try to feed him his favorite treats, but he'd just stare at them, his eyes vacant, his body stiff. It was as though he had lost all connection to the world around him, retreating into some private, unreachable place. One morning I found him in the hallway, sitting perfectly still, staring at the wall. His tail was tucked tightly between his legs, and he trembled ever so slightly. He didn't react when I called his name, didn't move a muscle when I knelt beside him. I reached out to touch him, and when my fingers brushed against his fur, I felt a sharp jolt of cold, like touching ice. His body was freezing to the touch, as if the life had drained from him. I pulled my hand back, my heart racing, a feeling of dread swelling in my chest. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and I didn't know how to fix it. I tried talking to my parents about it, but they barely acknowledged me. Their eyes seemed to gloss over whenever I spoke, as if they were hearing me but not truly listening. My father muttered something about being tired, and my mother simply nodded absently, her gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. I couldn't help but feel that Max's behavior was somehow tied to the strange, otherworldly force that had settled in our home. The box, the object hidden in the fridge, had set something in motion. Something that was now unraveling everything: our routines, our relationships, our sense of normalcy. The house, once familiar, had become a prison, and Max, my loyal companion, was no longer the creature I had known. He was a sentinel, trapped in a nightmare, a warning that I couldn't ignore. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of Max howling, a long, mournful cry that sent a chill down my spine. I shot out of bed, panic clawing at my throat, and rushed down the stairs. By the time I reached the living room, he had fallen silent, his body curled up on the floor, eyes wide and unblinking, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. It was then that I realized the strange presence, the unease that had been growing in the house, was not just affecting Max. It was affecting me too. I was trapped in a world where reality no longer made sense, where every corner held a whisper of something unknown, something that pulled at the edges of my sanity. And Max, poor Max, was the only one who seemed to understand.